So the objective of this session is to basically kind of chat through some of the risks and opportunities associated with technology use, and kind of provide a bit of guidance, I suppose, for anyone who's a parent or carer, or even really applying this to your own life should you not have children or vulnerable people that you're looking after, to kind of just increase awareness of some of the different tools and techniques we can use in order to maintain safe internet usage. So I'll kick off. Sorry, I've got someone raising their hand. Did you need anything, or are you okay? Okay to start? Cool, great. So I'm sure we're all kind of quite aware that access to technology has increased. So there was a recent study that was performed in 2021 by the American Institute of Pediatrics, which stated that children's access to technology and screen time had increased fourfold in the 5 years prior. So between 2015 and 2020, the number of hours per day children had access to technology and screens had increased by a significant proportion, some amounting up to 10 to 12 hours a day, which of course is absolutely seems kind of quite extreme. However, this kind of makes sense a little bit in terms of when we consider how the learning environment has changed for children, and also how technology is used in our day-to-day jobs and how we work. So alongside the modern opportunities that we have, there's a lot of modern risks as well. But in particular, in the case of children and vulnerable people, technology it can be used to learn. It can be used to keep themselves entertained. I know a lot of people who use iPads and iPhones in order to help their children learn and develop, but mostly be able to handle kind of different situations, and especially in the state of managing children with particular developmental issues or neurodivergence, things like screen time is a really great way to kind of provide an alternative way for those children to learn and engage. Children also learn through becoming responsible online, and using technology from the outset can really enhance that learning curve for them. And ultimately as well, keeping themselves connected is particularly important. So there's a lot of modern risks as well that are associated with safe kind of internet usage. I'm sure you're kind of quite aware as well of kind of the increase in prevalence of kind of different scams, WhatsApp scams in particular. I kind of think back to, the rise of technology usage throughout the COVID period. And actually, there was kind of a spate of scams involving kind of access to the vaccine or understanding test results, where people were kind of, saying, oh, pay £250 in order to get your results of your COVID test, things like that. TikTok as well, in particular, is particularly prevalent for scams and issues. And all of these screenshots are taken from a site called Kidslox, which focuses on online safety for children. But it kind of goes broader than that. How your child is interacting or engaging with technology has a real impact on how they are kind of developing their thoughts and feelings and their views on the world. So having access to technology, access to the viewpoints of others is in some cases a really great way of broadening people's horizons, but also who are the negative influences that might be prevalent or might have a platform that we might not necessarily approve of, and how do those viewpoints align with what we teach our children is incredibly important. And also, finally, looking at parental controls. There's an element with kind of, any child rearing or carer setting where you have to allow a certain level of freedom and understanding. So understanding how we apply the appropriate controls that are adequate and consistent is really, really important for kind of fostering, helping support kind of developing brains, but also protecting them from some of the negative aspects. There's not only kind of that mental aspect we need to consider, we also need to consider the physical implication of access to technology. So there's been I'm sure a lot of us, when we were younger, we were told by our parents to, not watch TV all the time because our eyes would go square. That's something that's, eye strain, things like tendinitis as well, children having cases of tennis elbow and early onset arthritis as well from using technology. These are all kind of certain risks that we need to consider when we're allowing access to these particular platforms. So I want to talk a little bit currently about social engineering, because I think it applies to kind of, not only children, not only vulnerable peoples, but also ourselves. We are all quite susceptible to being, to kind of, being maybe targets for social engineering. And I kind of wanted to touch on this topic because I think it's highly relevant for all of us. So first of all, primarily, what is social engineering? And social engineering refers to basically the manipulation of individuals to divulge confidential information. So this is, your classic email phishing link that's maybe come from a dubious email address asking you to send them £1,000 really urgently because we need to pay an invoice, for example. But social engineering itself is informed quite heavily by our digital footprint, and how susceptible we are to social engineering attempts is dictated by how we interact with technology. So if you think about, your digital footprint on LinkedIn, how you interact with people on Instagram, maybe you have a TikTok account that links all those together alongside a Meta account, how you interact in the privacy settings that you have for those particular platforms kind of informs how attackers might view you and might view your certain weaknesses. So within cybersecurity, we look at risks of kind of spoofing. Spoofing is where you're pretending to be someone that you're not, or you're maybe making it appear like you're someone that you're not. And these can happen over a variety of different methods, whether it's kind of, over mobile, over email. VoIP spoofing as well is particularly interesting one. But with the rise of things like, deep fake and AI audio, things like that, these social engineering techniques become much more enhanced. And the way we can mitigate a lot of them is recognizing that we have an online presence, whether we like it or not, and being able to make informed decisions on risk on how we present ourselves online. So I wanted to touch a little bit on why social engineering is kind of a bit of a risk to us, and it plays upon these key areas. So the reason social engineering works is because quite often we perceive the recipient or the sender is perceived to be a trustworthy, authoritative figure. Maybe there's a sense of fear and urgency. We're also, as people, quite susceptible to being quite curious about things. Okay, well, what if I do respond to this? What if I do engage with this person? What happens? And there may be some level of overconfidence as well. Because we work in tech, we sometimes maybe get lulled into a bit of false sense of security that actually us as a target might not actually be as real as a risk as we might perceive it to be. And so all of these things are really kind of fold into why social engineering can be so effective. Things like recency and primary effects as well. So knowing a piece of information that might be quite close to that particular individual can help make it incredibly convincing. And the reason I'm bringing these aspects up is when we're talking to or engaging with either vulnerable people or children with regards to talking about cybersecurity risks, we have to understand what leads the risks to manifest and what allows social engineering and scams, hacking, all of these things, how they have kind of a psychological basis behind them. And it can help us to describe the risk and explain it in a much more effective way. I just wanted to touch a little bit on kind of common phishing techniques, common social engineering techniques, because they're not just limited to phishing. So things like pretexting and baiting, impersonation, and these are all kind of quite, I guess, slightly less obvious techniques that you might not have seen, but are still quite prevalent. Quizzes and surveys as well. I think this is probably a lot more common on places like Facebook / Meta, where you have people asking, your hero name is the first car you owned and the place that you were born. And so loads of people put loads of comments down, and then that quite often leads to be useful information for determining what people's passwords are. So these kind of quizzes and surveys are quite, I think they're maybe a bit outdated, and you don't see as many of them anymore. But they definitely still get people, and they do form the basis of a lot of reconnaissance work that's performed by hackers. The top one there being, of course, phishing. We're all fairly aware of the risks of phishing, and the kind of the key work that's done to prevent that, around having that awareness of what does bad look like. And I think as well, if you think back to that slide on the psychology, you can begin to identify the different components of a phishing email pretty well, and identify where they're using the fact that they might be a trusted body, they might appear to be authoritative, they may be trying to use some fear and urgency in order to get you to do an action all of a sudden. You can really begin to build up your defenses against this particular technique. So here are a couple more examples of knowing what to look out for. These are not just limited to your child or your child's platform. This is also for yourselves as well. So looking for very obvious examples of kind of phishing attempts, or where there's some social engineering. The Instagram one, which is kind of second from the left there, actually is really quite good, because you can kind of tell how these particular phishing attempts or these scams work incredibly well, is because they're incredibly detailed, and they quite often are very hard to distinguish. And I think if you have someone who has access to technology that maybe doesn't know what the signs to look out for, you can see how this very quickly gets quite nasty. So how can we help, and how can we engage with kind of children and vulnerable people, anyone who's in a kind of a care position? How do we engage with these risks, and how do we describe them in a way that we can help our children or our vulnerable people understand? So the first key element to this is open communication. We have to build a foundation of trust and open dialogue with your child about their online experiences. It's very easy for us to shut down as kind of parents or carers and go into a mode of, very active defense, deny everything, stop, shut it all off. We throw the iPad out the window kind of thing. But that doesn't really help the child understand what the risks are. And I think quite often there's a bit of a balancing act that has to happen with technology and child safety, because there's a great deal of reliance on technology for school and learning. The COVID crisis kind of really enhanced that need and that understanding to recognize that, access to internet is one of those kind of basic foundational rights, because it provided so much access to learning opportunities that we didn't really acknowledge ahead of that time. It's important as well to act as a safe space for your child or person, to encourage them to actually communicate with you and address any concerns or questions they may have. Quite often there'll be a variety of different TikTok trends, some of which are incredibly harmful, some of which aren't harmful and completely benign. Allowing your child to explore those whilst keeping an open channel of communication is really important, as it allows them to explore and grow and develop, but also provides that balancing act between kind of maintaining online safety. And then ultimately, listening without judgment is of course crucial to maintaining that open communication stream. So setting clear boundaries as well. So maybe a bit converse to what I said on the previous slide, but understanding, putting bounds within around internet usage. There's also so there's a number of resources that I've included at the end of this presentation to talk through kind of some different technical controls you can put in. So things like web content filtering, how to set up parental controls on different, iPads or Android tablets, things like that. You could set kind of hard timers as well. So from the time between 5 p.m. and 7 p.m., free access, but beyond that, you cannot access the content on the iPad. But also as well, limiting that access to applications and making sure that you've got oversight and awareness of the controls that you have in place. Along with anything, consistency is key. Enforcing these rules and explaining the reasoning by them can help children and vulnerable people adjust to the changes, and also can help them kind of raise questions and maintain that open communication that you need. And also monitoring your child's online activity as well is particularly important to identify if there's any particular safeguarding concerns around the content that they may be consuming. All of which, a lot of technical controls that you can kind of put in place, all of which usually, depending on what kind of piece of technology you're using, whether it's an Apple product, Android product, there's a lot of guideline and documentation out there that can support you with setting these things up. The next bit is to educate on risk. It's important that children as they develop, become cognizant of the risks online. They may not unnecessarily understand them to a certain degree, but they also may be highly perceptive to them as well. It really depends on kind of how you approach the conversation and your child's familiarity with these sorts of things. But allowing them to understand what things like cyberbullying and scams and inappropriate content may look like can help them make much more informed decisions. It's also about kind of, once again, maintaining that open communication and allowing them to recognize warning signs and respond appropriately. And these might not always be easy conversations to have with your child or your vulnerable person. However, they're completely necessary in this kind of main safeguarding piece. And ultimately, we want to empower them. We want them to be able to make their own decisions about the content they're consuming and to keep themselves safe as well. So giving them the knowledge and the tools to protect themselves online is incredibly critical. So a bit more about those technical controls. So once again, the parental controls are really important. They're important from that visibility perspective, but also gives you peace of mind in terms of, knowing what they can and can't look at, what they have access to and what they don't. And like anything, this has to be a proactive effort. We can't just expect to kind of passively assume that everything is fine. We need to be proactive and engaged in monitoring your child's online activity, but also being mindful to respect their privacy. They are people, so we don't want to kind of be too overbearing and really putting our nose in it. And ultimately, children and people in general respond very well to positive reinforcement. And if you lead by example, you can really be a positive role model for your child or vulnerable person, and kind of model that responsible internet usage for them. So practicing good online etiquette yourself, thinking back to when I was kind of mentioning, your digital footprint and online safety, encouraging them to create strong passwords, showing them what a password manager is, for example, really engaging with them and leading by example is absolutely critical in this field. There was a study that came out fairly recently. The first one actually came out in the 1970s around child emulated behavior in parents, and a recent kind of redo of that study came out in the past couple of years, which was looking at how children's online habits are reflected by how they see their parents engaging with something. So reinforcing kind of those activities that sit aside from technology is really, really good at kind of, you know, building your child out to be kind of like quite, I suppose, well-rounded with this, and understand all those technology risks and behave in a responsible manner. And like anything, it's important to monitor and reassess regularly. You know, these things, they all work kind of together to be a cohesive piece. They're not all silver bullets that fix everything all at once. If you do have any kind of questions or concerns, things like the NCSC group are particularly good at kind of providing online safety advice and things like that. But ultimately, everyone's different, every child is different, every person is different, and so finding out what works is a bit of a iterative approach. So making sure you're adopting different strategies, you're maintaining that open communication, and that ultimately, where you have a knowledge gap or you don't know if something's right or wrong, that you're seeking the answers to those questions yourself as well. That is the end of the talk. I've provided some useful resources here at the end that will be distributed with this this PowerPoint deck. Mostly focused on the NCSC, which is the National Cybersecurity Centre run by the UK government. They provide really, really good advice on online safety for everything from families, small businesses, and also Kidslox as well, provide really, really good guidance on, you know, specific trends on platforms such as TikTok and Twitch and things like that. So they're really there for kind of everyone to use. But thank you very much for your time today.